Welcome you to this lecture on employee engagement. We're going to spend the next 7 or 8 minutes together looking at this topic and hopefully provide you with some new insights on this really very exciting topic that has come into the forefront of many business leaders in the last 3 decades. So, specifically in this lecture, what we're going to take a look at is the impact that employee engagement and disengagement has on the marketplace in a dollars and cents perspective. We're also going to look at some definitions of employee engagement. And finally, we're going to put some of these ideas and concepts into practice and see what do these constructs actually look like when you apply them to a particular role within an organization. All right, so let's take a look first here at employee engagement levels. Now, there are a number of studies out there that are talking about how engaged employees are within their roles across the United States. And one particular study, a Gallup study, and this is consistent year over year, is about 2/3 of employees are disengaged in their work. About 25% are passively engaged, and only about 11% are engaged within their work roles. Now, what does this mean from a dollars and cents perspective when we take collectively and we look at this across the United States? It's a massive number. It's about 450 to 550 billion dollars are lost annually through having disengaged employees. So when business leaders began to see the impact that employee disengagement and engagement were having on their bottom line, they began to sit up and listen and say, okay, well, what can we do as business leaders about increasing employee engagement? So before we will get into that further in this course, but before we do that, let's take a look really at what is employee engagement. So let's look at some of the definitions so that you can understand what the nuances and some of the definitions that are out there from these researchers. And then also, what does the construct of employee engagement look like? And then how can that be applied within a business setting? All right, so employee engagement definitions. I chose 3 for us to take a peek at today. And the first is by William Kahn. William Kahn wrote the seminal article on employee engagement. He coined the term employee engagement, and he says that engagement is just simply this harnessing of organizational members' selves to their work. So harnessing employees to their work. And in engagement, how people employ, how they express themselves physically, cognitively, and emotionally while performing their roles. We're going to talk a little bit more about Kahn's research in a moment, but let's take a look at Schuch and Wohlard. So just a couple decades later, they were able to look at employee engagement, and they say that it is an employee's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors directed toward the organization's goals. So similar to Kahn's, but what they did was they did a meta-analysis of research up to that point on employee engagement, and they looked at across this time frame of all the engagement definitions and felt that this was one that clarified what employee engagement was. And then also the researchers at Gallup, they define engagement as those who are involved in their work, they're enthusiastic about their work, and they're committed to their work and their workplace. So those are our 3 definitions for us to think about as we move into this final section of today's lecture on employee engagement. So employee engagement constructs. So when we think about the constructs, what are some of the kind of the ideas that are likely to to be the building blocks of employee engagement. So Kahn says uh, that there are three areas that an individual would possess in order to be engaged in their work. And the first is meaningfulness. So, in other words, does that role bring a sense of return on investment? Does it bring a sense of meaning into their lives by performing that particular role? The second, if they're engaged, they have to feel a sense of safety. And what I mean by safety, that's beyond the physical safety. This is also when you bring your full self, your skill set, your knowledge, your personality, who you are as a human being, when you bring all of that to that particular role, do you feel safe in that there would be no negative consequence to your career, to your status within that organization, and even to your personal self image? And then finally, availability. This is a sense of being available for that role on three different levels. Are you physically available to do that role? Are you emotionally available to do that role? And then do you have the psychological resources necessary um, to to perform that role? So Khan is saying if you find meaningfulness in your work role, if you feel safe, you're able to bring your full self into that particular role, and you're also available on multiple levels, physically, emotionally, and psychologically, to bring into that role, then you are considered engaged within that work role. So, in this last minute together, what does this mean, say, in practice? So, let's say we have a woman who is a manager of HR resources. In that role, does she find meaning, investing herself week in and week out, year over year? If she finds meaning, then she's on her way to being engaged. It does she feel safe? And again, there are no negative consequences by bringing her full self. Does she feel safe within that organization, its culture, and her status within the company by bringing her full self? And if she does that, will this advance her career? Um, and then finally, is she physically, emotionally, and psychologically available to bring her full self to that role? And does she have resources in these areas to be that HR manager that the organization needs? So that last one, availability, can sometimes trip students up. So let me provide this real life example that actually happened last week to me. There was a colleague of mine who had the opportunity to move into a manager role, and we were talking about it, and I said, you know, this is an opportunity you've been wanting. And what do you think about stepping into that role at this time? And she said, this is something I've wanted. I, I know that I would find a lot of fulfillment. So that's where that meaning comes in a role like that. I feel that, I want to work in that particular organization and I can bring my knowledge into it. So she knows it'd be a good career move. But she said, I at this time, I'm going through some personal things outside of work. I'm not sure that I'm going to have my full self essentially to bring into that role. So maybe the timing isn't right. So when you think about that in a real world setting, she was able to knock out that I'm not fully available for this from a psychological perspective. So therefore, she wouldn't be fully engaged. So when you think about these constructs of employee engagement, um, hopefully this will help us begin to think about employee engagement, the definition of it, what it means in the workplace, and how you can begin to put these ideas into practice where you are within your organization.